October 25, 1944. The dawn over the Philippine Sea was calm, silent, and deceptively peaceful. But beneath that calm, two mighty fleets were about to collide in one of the most lopsided, chaotic, and heroic battles ever fought at sea. This was the battle off Samar, the final act of Japan's once mighty Imperial Navy, and the day a handful of American destroyers and escort carriers stood against an armada of battleships. It was a battle no one expected to survive, and yet it became one of the most legendary stands in naval history. In October 1944, the United States had begun its long-awaited return to the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur had landed on Leyte Island, fulfilling his famous promise, "I shall return." To protect the invasion, the U.S. Navy deployed the largest fleet the world had ever seen, nearly 800 ships spread across the Philippine archipelago. But the Japanese were desperate. They saw Leyte as the last chance to stop the American advance. If they lost the Philippines, Japan would be cut off from its vital oil supplies in the East Indies. So they devised a bold and complex counterattack, Operation Sho-Go, a three-pronged naval trap meant to destroy the U.S. invasion fleet. From the north, a decoy carrier force would lure Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from Leyte. From the south and center, two more forces, packed with battleships and cruisers, would converge and smash the vulnerable landing forces. And the Americans took the bait. On the night of October 24th, Halsey's scouts spotted the Japanese carriers to the north. Believing this was the main threat, he raced his entire fast carrier task force away from Leyte, leaving the invasion area protected only by Task Unit 77.4.3, known by its radio call sign, Taffy 3. Taffy 3 wasn't built for battle. It was a small escort group of 6 slow jeep carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 tiny destroyer escorts. Their job was to provide air cover and anti-submarine patrols for the troops ashore, not to fight battleships. But fate had other plans. To the west, steaming through the San Bernardino Strait, was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, a nightmare formation of Japan's last great battleships and cruisers. At its heart were the Yamato and Nagato, each bristling with 18-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship. They were joined by heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers, over 23 warships in total, each one vastly more powerful than anything Taffy 3 possessed. Kurita had been ambushed and bloodied the day before in the Sibuyan Sea, losing the battleship Musashi to waves of American carrier aircraft. But despite heavy losses, his fleet still sailed determined to reach the vulnerable landing ships in Leyte Gulf. At dawn, his lookouts spotted the silhouettes of American carriers on the horizon. To Kurita, this looked like the main U.S. fleet. He had no idea they were merely slow escort carriers and destroyers, the smallest ships in the American Navy. So he ordered his entire force to attack. At 6:45 in the morning, a Japanese cruiser fired the first salvo. Massive shell splashes erupted near the carrier Gambier Bay, sending towering geysers of water skyward. Within minutes, dozens of shells began raining down from beyond the horizon. The sky turned into chaos. Pilots scrambled to launch their planes. Many took off armed only with machine guns or practice bombs, anything they could find. Others had no ammunition at all, yet they took to the skis anyway, hopping to distract the enemy. Below them, the 3 destroyers, the Johnston, the Hoel, and the Heermann, along with the tiny escorts Samuel B, Roberts, Raymond, and Dennis, began laying smoke screens to protect the carriers. Captain Ernest Evans of the USS Johnston saw the enemy flashes on the horizon and made a decision that would make him a legend. "We will attack," he said calmly. He knew it was suicide, but he also knew that if they didn't fight, the carriers and thousands of men would die. At 7 in the morning, Johnston turned out of the smoke and charged toward the oncoming Japanese line, alone. The destroyer's guns roared to life, firing as fast as her crew could load. She closed to within 10,000 yards of the heavy cruiser Kumano and unleashed a full spread of torpedoes. Seconds later, one struck home. The explosion ripped the bow off the Japanese cruiser, crippling her instantly. The Johnston had drawn blood, but now she was in the open, facing dozens of enemy guns. The Yamato herself turned her massive turrets toward the tiny ship. Each shell weighed nearly a ton. They fired, and the sea erupted around the Johnston. The blast force threw men off their feet. Shrapnel tore through her decks. One shell slammed into the bridge, killing and wounding several crewmen. Evans himself was wounded, but he refused to leave the bridge. He ordered the ship to lay more smoke and rejoin the others, but the Japanese gunners had marked her position. The Johnston was hit again and again, losing power, steering, and communications, yet she kept fighting. Meanwhile, the rest of Taffy 3's destroyers began their own desperate charge. The Hoel and Heermann broke from the smoke to launch torpedoes at the battleships, weaving through shellfire so intense it turned the sea into boiling foam. From above, American pilots dove through anti-aircraft fire, strafing cruisers and dropping bombs wherever they could. Some ran out of ammunition and began fake attack runs just to draw Japanese fire away from the ships below. Against all logic, the tiny American force was holding its ground and even turning the tide. The Japanese fleet, blinded by smoke and confusion, began to lose formation. Some ships turned to avoid torpedoes, others slowed to avoid collisions. Orders became garbled over the radio. Kurita's admirals couldn't believe what they were seeing, small destroyers charging battleships as if they were the hunters, not the hunted. By 8:30, the sea off Samar had become a nightmare of smoke, flame, and confusion. The carrier Gambier Bay was hit and began to list, her guns still firing as her crew tried to save her. Planes from the carriers continued to attack relentlessly, flying sortie after sortie with whatever they had left. The battle was far from over, but the courage of a few small ships had already done the impossible. They had made the mighty Imperial Japanese Navy hesitate. And in that hesitation lay the first glimmer of survival. The morning sky over the Philippine Sea had turned gray with smoke and fire. The calm of dawn was gone. The battle off Samar was now a storm of metal and courage. By 8:45, the sea was a boiling cauldron of explosions. Shells from battleships landed all around the tiny escort carriers of Taffy 3. Each blast sent columns of water hundreds of feet into the air. Fragments rained down like steel rain. In the middle of that chaos, the American destroyers, nicknamed tin cans because of their thin armor, refused to run. They attacked. The USS Johnston, Hoel, and Heermann, along with the destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond, and Dennis, turned directly into the enemy line. It was the kind of charge that should have been impossible. But the men aboard these ships knew that if they didn't fight, the carriers behind them would be slaughtered. Commander Ernest Evans of the Johnston had already been wounded. His ship was battered and burning, but he refused to stop. He took his destroyer back into the fight. His crew could barely believe it. They were facing Japan's most powerful warships, battleships like Yamato and Nagato, whose shells were big enough to crush a destroyer in a single hit. And yet they charged. The Hoel and Heermann raced out of the smoke at full speed, their guns firing furiously. They zigzagged through towering shell splashes, closing the distance until their torpedoes could reach. Fire 1, Fire 2. Torpedoes roared into the sea, leaving long white trails in the waves. Japanese cruisers turned hard to avoid the deadly weapons, throwing their formations into chaos. For every torpedo fired, dozens of massive shells answered. The sea erupted around the American ships, but the destroyers pressed closer, their decks shaking from the shock of their own guns. The Hoel was hit repeatedly. Her forward guns were blown apart, her bridge smashed. Still, She fired her remaining torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Haguro before another salvo struck her engine room. She began to slow, flames licking her sides. Her captain gave the order to abandon ship, but many crewmen refused to leave. They stayed at their guns until the water closed over them. Nearby, the Heermann was the last destroyer still fighting with full power. She charged directly at the Yamato itself, the largest battleship ever built. From her bridge, the crew could see the enormous flashes of Yamato's 18-inch guns firing in their direction. Each blast sounded like thunder tearing through the sky. The first salvo missed, throwing up geysers that nearly capsized the destroyer. The second straddled her. The third landed close enough to shake her hull to its core. But Heermann kept going. Her crew launched torpedoes at the Japanese line, forcing the mighty battleship to turn away. For a few minutes, one of the most powerful war machines on Earth had retreated from a single American destroyer. Above the battle, aircraft from the escort carriers swooped in again and again. Most of them were armed with nothing but machine guns or a single small bomb. But they dove straight through anti-aircraft fire, strafing Japanese cruisers and dropping their meager payloads with deadly precision. A group of Avengers and Wildcats from the carrier Gambier Bay made repeated attacks on the cruiser Chikuma. They hit her with bombs, rockets, and gunfire until she began to list heavily, her decks aflame. The air was filled with smoke, fire, and the roar of engines. At 9:15, the carrier Gambier Bay was hit by enemy shells. One struck her engine room, slowing her down. Another hit near her flight deck, setting her ablaze. She tried to fight back, her gunners firing until their ammunition was gone. But she was outmatched. Her crew fought to save her, but it was too late. Gambier Bay began to list heavily to port. "Abandon ship," came the order. Many of her sailors went into the burning sea as she rolled over and sank, the only American aircraft carrier ever sunk by naval gunfire. Yet even as she went down, her aircraft kept attacking. At 9:30, the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts spotted a Japanese cruiser closing in. The Roberts was barely more than a patrol ship, with guns half the size of her enemy. But her captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, shouted to his crew, "We're going in." The Roberts charged at full speed, firing everything she had. Her guns fired so fast that her barrels began to glow red. She scored multiple hits on the cruiser Chakai, setting her ablaze. Then she launched her torpedoes and turned back through the smoke. Moments later, shells tore through her thin hull. The Roberts shuddered from the impacts. Her crew kept firing until she could no longer stay afloat. As the order came to abandon ship, one sailor said quietly, "We fought the best we could." By mid-morning, every American ship in Taffy 3 was damaged, burning, or sinking. Yet the Japanese fleet had been stopped cold. From the Yamato's bridge, Admiral Kurita stared at the horizon in disbelief. He had expected to find American battleships and fleet carriers. Instead, he had been fighting tiny escort ships and losing time, order, and momentum. His cruisers were scattered. His battleships were low on ammunition. His air cover was gone. And from above, the sky was now filled with even more American planes from other carrier groups converging on his position. Kurita's subordinates urged him to press the attack, but something inside him hesitated. The smoke, the confusion, and the furious defense had created the illusion of a much larger force. He didn't realize that the Americans were fighting, with almost nothing left. At 10:20, Kurita gave an order no one expected. He turned his fleet around. The battleships and cruisers that had terrified Taffy 3 began to withdraw, vanishing into the smoke and mist from which they had come. Down below, sailors on the surviving American ships could hardly believe it. The enemy was retreating. They had survived the impossible. But the cost had been staggering. Hundreds of men were dead, their ships lost or burning. Many were adrift in the sea, clinging to debris, surrounded by oil and fire. As the surviving ships began to search for survivors, one message was sent out to the fleet. "This is Taffy 3. The enemy is retiring. We have fought valiantly and inflicted heavy damage." For the men of Taffy 3, those words were not pride. They were relief, exhaustion, and disbelief. They had stood against overwhelming odds and won, not through firepower but through courage. The battle off Samar was not over. The fight for survival was only beginning. The sun had climbed higher over the Philippine Sea, revealing the full scale of the destruction. Smoke still twisted across the horizon, punctuated by flames from burning ships and the faint trails of drifting debris. The battle off Samar had ended, but the cost was etched into the waves and into the memories of those who survived. Out of the 6 escort carriers, only 3 remained afloat, all damaged. The destroyers and destroyer escorts had been decimated. The USS Johnston, Hoel, and Samuel B. Roberts lay at the bottom of the sea, their crews counted among the brave who had sacrificed everything. Hundreds of sailors were dead, many missing, and countless others clung to wreckage, fighting exhaustion, shock, and injuries as they awaited rescue. Yet despite the devastation, the battle had been a triumph of courage and ingenuity over overwhelming odds. A small, lightly armed task unit had faced a Japanese fleet of battleships, heavy cruisers and destroyers, and had survived. More than survival, they had inflicted damage far beyond what anyone could have expected. Ships like the Chikuma, Chakai, and even the mighty Yamato had been forced to retreat. Their mission to destroy the invasion fleet failed. The question of why Admiral Kurita withdrew has been debated ever since. Exhaustion, confusion, and the apparent illusion of a larger American force all played a role. His fleet had lost coordination under the relentless attacks of aircraft and the daring maneuvers of destroyers. Kurita's hesitation allowed Taffy 3 to survive and continue providing air cover for the Leyte landings. Some historians argue that the courage of a handful of tin cans changed the course of the Pacific War, buying the Americans critical time and preserving the momentum of the Leyte campaign. Rescue operations began immediately. Aircraft from the surviving carriers circled overhead, dropping life rafts and supplies to sailors in the water. Destroyers and other nearby ships scoured the area, plucking survivors from the sea. Every man saved was a testament to the skill, determination, and camaraderie of the U.S. Navy. Those who had survived the impossible bore witness to what had happened that morning, a David versus Goliath story at sea. Back on shore, the soldiers and Marines of the Leyte invasion force continued their advance, largely unaware of the narrow escape Taffy 3 had achieved. Had Kurita pressed the attack, the beachhead could have been destroyed, altering the trajectory of the Philippines campaign and potentially delaying Japan's ultimate defeat. The heroism of the men of Taffy 3 was recognized quickly. Many were awarded the Navy Cross, Silver Star, and other honors, though the full story of their bravery remained largely unknown to the public for decades. They fought not for glory, but because it was their duty, because they refused to abandon the vulnerable ships and men behind them. Among the notable stories was that of Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland and the Samuel B. Roberts. The destroyer escort that fought like a battleship became a symbol of American resolve and daring. The ship's last torpedo hit crippled a Japanese cruiser before she went down, a fitting final act of defiance. Captain Ernest Evans of the Johnston, wounded repeatedly, went down with his ship but inspired countless others with his leadership. The Hoel, despite being completely outgunned, drew fire from multiple Japanese vessels, allowing other American ships to survive. The aftermath of the battle also sent ripples through the Japanese command. Kurita's failure to press the advantage at Leyte Gulf represented a turning point. The Imperial Japanese Navy, already weakened by previous losses at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and the Sibuyan Sea, could not recover. The battle off Samar exposed the vulnerabilities of Japan's surface fleet and demonstrated the growing dominance of American carrier aviation, destroyer tactics, and combined arms strategy. The bravery, sacrifice, and ingenuity displayed that day exemplified the highest ideals of naval warfare. A few small ships, fighting against overwhelming firepower, had changed history through sheer audacity. The battle off Samar remains a testament to courage, leadership, and the human spirit under the most impossible circumstances. Decades later, survivors would recount their experiences, often with humility. "We were just doing our job," many would say. But history remembers the names of the Johnston, Hoel, Samuel B. Roberts, and the men who manned them. It remembers Taffy 3, the tiny escort carriers, and the destroyers that charged battleships. Their actions were extraordinary, a beacon of heroism in a war defined by mass destruction. The sea off Samar is now quiet, its waves reflecting the sun like liquid steel. Ships lie sunken beneath the water, their rusted hulls holding the echoes of guns, torpedoes, and the courage of those who fought. Yet the story lives on in books, archives, and videos like this one. It is a story of bravery, sacrifice, and the impossible achieved against all odds. The battle off Samar is more than a footnote in naval history. It is a reminder that heroism can come in the smallest ships and from the most unlikely places. That day, ordinary men performed extraordinary deeds. That day, courage, ingenuity, and resolve turned the tide, if only for a moment. That day, the battle off Samar became a legend.